If you're passionate about military aviation and great stories, subscribe to our channel and help us reach our subscriber goal. We're a new channel and we're counting on your support. Click subscribe now and enjoy today's video. On the humid spring mornings of New Haven, when war veterans returning to university gathered to exchange memories in the Gothic brick dining hall, George Herbert Walker Bush hardly stood out. He was only 22, had gentle manners, a restrained smile, and rarely spoke of the weight of the medals tucked away in the back of a drawer. If someone asked, he would shift the conversation to Ivy League baseball or to the waiter job he held at night to supplement his scholarship. Yet it only took the Atlantic breeze to stir the flag above the commons for flashes of the Pacific to return, too vivid. The acrid smell of burning fuel, the harsh roar of Japanese machine guns, the silhouette of a volcanic island rising against stormy clouds. Just before turning 20, that lean young man had faced a moment when his entire life hinged on the split second of a failing fire extinguisher. The decision to release bombs over a hostile target and the courage to jump from a burning plane. Trusting the sea would not deny him refuge. Raised in Prescott, in the Connecticut interior, George had grown up in the shadow of wooded hills and under the corporate aura of his father, Prescott Bush, a powerful figure on Wall Street. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, changed his fate. Within 6 months, defying family expectations of going straight to Yale, he enlisted in the United States Navy. He became the youngest member of the Naval Aviator Training Program. At the time, many instructors were hesitant to train such inexperienced youth, but recruit Bush displayed a rare determination. Flying to him meant fulfilling a calling greater than personal ambition. At 18, he earned his gold Naval Aviator wings and the rank of ensign, becoming, according to official records, the youngest naval pilot in U.S. forces at that time. Assigned to Torpedo Squadron VT-51, he embarked on the light aircraft carrier USS San Jacinto. Unlike the nimble fighters dueling Zeros in aerial maneuvers, TBF Avengers had to endure long journeys, carrying bombs or torpedoes under their belly, fly low over the sea, and often strike stationary land targets while facing clouds of anti-aircraft fire. The routine demanded iron discipline, waking before sunrise, planning routes over the near-featureless Pacific grids, checking each flap, inspecting control cables, testing radios, calibrating the compass. In the cramped cockpit, he shared space with the radio operator and the gunner. They depended on one another as parts of a single organism made of metal and courage. Between May and August 1944, the San Jacinto took part in raids that swept over Japanese installations in Guam, Saipan, and Palau. Bush carried out anti-submarine patrols and bomber escort missions, but it was in early September that he would face his greatest trial. The target, designated by Admiral Spruance, was the small island of Chichijima, part of the Bonin Archipelago, strategically valuable for its radars and communications linking outposts to the Japanese mainland. Destroying antennas and ammunition depots that meant blinding the enemy and easing future Allied landings. At dawn on September 2nd, the crew lined up at the edge of the deck, breathing in salty air mixed with diesel fumes. Bush and his crew, gunner Warren Macon and radio operator John Delaney, donned inflatable life vests, strapped fluorescent signal boards to their belts, and climbed the catwalk to the olive-drab Avenger. The Wright Cyclone engine shook the steel hull to life. Upon receiving the signal from the tower, they moved to Catapult 2. A metallic snap, a roar, and the plane dropped for a moment before lifting over the choppy sea. The initial leg went smoothly. The rising sun painted pink clouds as the squadron approached the Japanese defense zone. Bush held cruising speed, waiting for the second group of Hellcat fighters to take escort position on the left. Then, coastal gunboats opened fire. Orange tracers streaked the sky. Black flak bursts popped all around, jostling the Avenger like a toy. He dove to 2,500 feet, leveled instinctively, and despite the vibrating fuselage, kept the nose aimed at the target. A supply depot embedded in Chichijima's rocky slope. He pressed the release. The 500-pound bomb slipped away, vanishing in a flash. At that moment, a burst hit the right wing. The Avenger jolted violently. Macon shouted over the intercom that the compartment was on fire. Thick smoke filled the cabin. The instruments flickered. Bush tried to climb, but the engine was spitting flames. His mouth and eyes stung. Every passing second could be the last. He shouted orders, "Prepare to bail out." He unlocked the canopy and pulled the extinguisher lever. Useless. The plane was already a flying torch. He turned toward open sea, desperate to avoid crashing into rock cliffs full of enemy outposts. Delaney never responded. Wounded or unconscious, he vanished in the smoke. Macon managed to unlock the dorsal hatch, but a wave of heat knocked him back. Gasping for air, Bush yanked the parachute handle and leapt into emptiness. The cold wind muffled the blast as the Avenger exploded behind him. For a moment, he floated. In surreal silence, fists tight around the cords, until his body plunged into the crest of a wave that burned the scratches on his face. Salt water felt like boiling metal in his wounds. Waves battered him in cruel cycles. He clung to the emergency pack. Inside, a small signaling mirror, chocolate tablets, a canteen, anti-seasickness pills. He mentally repeated instructions. Stay calm, inflate the raft. The yellow raft opened with a compressed burst. He crawled inside, vomiting seawater, his chest burning with inhaled kerosene. Above, planes circled. He waved a flare, but the dogfight raged on. No pilot could risk descending. Hours dragged by. Humidity and searing sun stoked unbearable thirst. Memory shards pierced his clarity. Barbara's smile at prom. The steady hum of the radial engine during night patrols. The last handshake on deck. Suddenly, a steel plume emerged on the horizon. The submarine USS Finback surfaced, maneuvering slowly to avoid enemy lookouts. A sailor appeared on deck, tossing a rope. Bush swam, exhausted, arms numb as lead. Firm hands pulled him up. The wet deck felt like solid land for the first time in hours. He collapsed, groaning in relief. In the makeshift infirmary, they gave him light morphine for minor burns. The Finback's doctor, experienced in aviator rescues, watched him closely for delayed shock. That night, in the radio room, Bush heard encrypted transmissions announcing his rescue to Pacific Command. He learned that Macon and Delaney had not been found. The news cut deep. A sense of victory mixed with guilt for surviving alone. In the following weeks, as the Finback patrolled hostile waters, he joined 5 more rescues, climbing atop the conning tower with binoculars, scanning for downed pilots, driven by a desire to repay the luck that had spared him when he returned. To the San Jacinto in November, his fellow aviators could hardly believe it. He received the Distinguished Flying Cross for heroism in completing the mission before abandoning the aircraft. But the medal weighed on him, a constant reminder of lost comrades. On the morning loudspeakers announced the end of the war, Bush was at the Alameda Air Base in California. While crowds filled San Francisco's streets in a cathartic celebration, he walked alone to the pier and gazed at transport ships returning full of soldiers. He thought of Macon, of Delaney, of the incalculable number of young lives whose stories ended without closure. That's when he decided, if fate had granted him more time, it would be used for something greater than personal glory. He left active service in September 1945, married Barbara Pierce, moved to New Haven, and enrolled at Yale to study economics. On campus, he avoided the label of hero. He sat in the front rows, took meticulous notes and practiced baseball as if war weren't etched in his memory. But his sense of public service had become inescapable. Upon graduating, he moved to Texas, plunged into the oil industry, and learned to negotiate in the dusty fields of Midland. Every civilian challenge, no matter how small, echoed the cockpit. Quick calculations, emotional control, leadership under pressure. In the 1960s, as the country roiled with civil rights debates and Cold War tensions, Bush entered politics. He was still the same man who, clinging to an inflatable raft in the Pacific, had promised to be useful. Elected to the House of Representatives in 1966, he represented Texas with pragmatism, advocating balanced budgets and diplomatic strength. Appointed ambassador to the UN by Richard Nixon, then CIA director and Ronald Reagan's vice president, he carried in his pocket, almost like a relic, the small metal plate removed from the Avenger before the fateful takeoff. He touched it only on nights when flak and smoke haunted his dreams. When he took the oath as the 41st president on January 20th, 1989, the crowd at the National Mall heard him speak of a kinder, gentler nation. Analysts noted his references to America's moral responsibility in the post-Cold War world. Few noticed that in his words lay a direct reflection of the lesson learned in the Pacific. Civilization is not measured by firepower, but by the compassion shown in saving lives, whether in humanitarian operations in Somalia or the patient diplomacy that built coalitions during the Gulf crisis. Decades later, well into his 80s, Bush once again flew over the Atlantic in a commemorative air show. Seated in a T-6 Texan, he looked at the calm horizon. He told the pilot the sight of the ocean reminded him of the inner ocean every human carries. Vast, unpredictable, yet navigable with faith and discipline. He laughed when the maneuvers quickened his heartbeat like the Avenger days, then fell silent, contemplative. Perhaps he recalled the moment his parachute opened and the sea embraced him. Perhaps he felt, in that cold current of air, the breath of comrades who never returned. The story of George H.W. Bush as the pilot who came back from hell transcends the single act of bravery in 1944. It is the thread that stitches together youth, military service, grief, resilience, and public commitment. It shows how a single day in war can guide a lifetime of choices in peace, how the split second between pulling a parachute cord and falling into an unknown sea can redefine purpose, how invisible scars don't hinder service, they deepen one's sense of duty. In the calm Pacific waters where he nearly died, echo the questions he's asked himself ever since. Why did I survive when others didn't? What does it mean to deserve more years? His answer, built step by step, from the classroom to the White House, from college baseball to global crisis rooms, still echoes in generations who followed him in the Navy, in politics and in ordinary life. When fate grants you another chance, the greatest victory is to put each day in service of others. In a distant Houston twilight, surrounded by grandchildren playing in the yard, Bush would often pause, lean back in his chair, and gaze at the sky glowing orange. He once said that falling over Chichijima, he was sure he'd never see that warm sunset hue again. Since then, every sundown felt like a bonus gift, a reminder that hours are finite and therefore precious. The man who jumped from a flaming plane and floated through the war's firestorms chose to ground his life in the patient pursuit of understanding, partnerships, and compassion. Thus, the story that defined him doesn't end with the Avengers, explosion, or the heroic rescue, but with the deliberate decision to turn survival into legacy. That choice, silent, intimate, yet resolute, made George Herbert Walker Bush not just a former president or decorated veteran, but a symbol of steadfast responsibility, living proof that even when everything burns around you, it is still possible to choose integrity as your compass and make your testimony a beacon for others navigating seas of uncertainty. When he left the Oval Office at noon on that cold January 20th, 1993, George Herbert Walker Bush bore no expression of defeat, despite the quiet pain of a lost election. There was in him a serenity almost like the sea, like the calm surface before the breaking wave, forged by the certainty of someone who had once seen an engine burst into flames over Chichijima, and even then kept breathing. As the presidential helicopter slowly lifted over the South Lawn, the former commander smiled at his wife and gripped Barbara's hand tightly, a gesture that blended farewell and the promise of new beginnings. For both of them, it marked a return to civilian life, but also the start of a chapter in which the Pacific veteran would transform political influence into social diplomacy, adopting a style of engagement that reporters soon called duty after duty. 8 years as vice president and 4 as president had left deep marks, not only in the knees worn by old parachute fractures, but in the memories saturated with decisions that had reshaped international paths. The fall of the Berlin Wall, preceded by tense phone calls with Helmut Kohl and Mikhail Gorbachev, still surfaced in his dreams as the sound of concrete crashing onto stone. On early mornings in Kennebunkport, he would walk along the beach and recall that night in November 1989, when, separated only by transatlantic telephone lines, he had listened in real time as Germans crossed through the border checkpoints. He remembered thinking that some walls fall first within people, and that his role in that fragile moment of history had been to let change run its course without the abrupt interference of tanks he had once seen in Korea or NATO drills, even. So, the episode that demanded the greatest emotional control was another: the invasion of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein in August 1990. When the first satellite reports reached the Situation Room, Bush felt the same chill in his stomach that had preceded the dive over Chichijima. The moment one realizes there's no easy path between moral conviction and the risk of losing lives. For days, nightmares revisited him, of crews swallowed by the sea, memories that made each military decision more painful. When he announced Operation Desert Storm, his voice remained firm, but his left hand trembled slightly. Not from hesitation, but from the quiet acknowledgement that every order to strike carried a name, a face, a family. That's why he insisted on a broad coalition strategy, seeking legitimacy in the UN Security Council and minimizing the temptation for prolonged combat. When, in February 1991, Iraqi forces began retreating, generals urged a push to Baghdad. Bush held back, fearing a long occupation that would bring mourning on a scale far beyond what the Finback's little raft could ever hold. Upon returning to private life, the wave of popularity that once carried him receded like the ocean after a storm. The economy had faltered in his final months in office. At the ballot box, calls for domestic renewal outweighed memories of diplomatic victories. Yet the former president did not retreat into silence. The same restlessness that had once made him crawl across the Avenger's fuselage to save crewmates now pushed him toward unlikely partnerships. Shortly after leaving Washington, he received an invitation from Bill Clinton to visit the humanitarian front lines of Hurricane Andrew. He accepted immediately, bringing blankets and chlorine tablets, packed into crates on the bed of a truck. It marked the prelude to an unlikely duo, electoral rivals, yet allies in confronting catastrophes that knew no party lines. In 2004, when the tsunami swept across the Indian Ocean, Bush and Clinton flew together to Aceh and Phuket, embracing orphans and supervising the unloading of rice sacks. In the courtyard of a devastated school in Thailand, Bush knelt to plant tiny mangrove shoots beside children who smiled without quite knowing who the white-haired man with the gentle voice was. As photographers captured the scene, he quietly remarked that roots hold the earth just as stories hold the heart. Both require constant care, or erosion will claim them. His natural ease in humanitarian missions surprised advisors who had known him as a competitive tennis player and meticulous diary keeper. But the key to his devotion, once again, lay in the promise he had made to himself, in that inflatable raft. If he survived, he would repay the borrowed time with acts of compassion. In 2009, on his 85th birthday, he parachuted onto the lawn of the George Bush Presidential Complex in College Station. Images of the former pilot descending through the warm Texas air, arms wide open, touched news networks around the world. Veterans watching from wheelchairs lifted their hats, recognizing in the old commander the same spark that once embraced dawn roll calls in 1943. The years, however, did not spare him the pain known only by those who've tasted the thunder of loss. In 1994, the death of Richard Nixon revived memories of the near-daily goodbyes to squadron mates in the Pacific. Bush wept quietly at the funeral, cane in one hand, the handkerchief offered by Barbara in the other. 9 years later, it was his own daughter Robin, lost to leukemia in childhood, who reopened old wounds, stirring memories of silent hospital rooms, of untouched toys in a bedroom the couple had kept intact for a while. Even so, he would say in interviews that grief had taught him to accept not being able to control every variable in life, just as he had once accepted his inability to control the flames that overtook the TBF Avenger. His bond with his children became a source of pride and worry. When George W. Bush ran for president in 2000, the father gave gentle support but advised caution. In late-night calls, he would remind him that every campaign word would be weighed on a scale no different from the one used to measure strike orders. He emphasized the importance of listening to generals with the humility of someone who knows no technology can replace human judgment. After the September 11th attacks, the father visited his son in the Situation Room, not to give strategic advice, but to offer emotional support from someone who understood the burden of signing condolence letters. They didn't speak of the impending war. They talked of faith, of resilience, of how the nation's trauma echoed the frantic readiness drills of the San Jacinto. By 2012, when Barbara's health began requiring frequent attention, Bush reduced his travel, but not his public acts. He welcomed students at Walker's Point, spoke about volunteer service, and recounted Finback stories more as cautionary tales than displays of valor. After complications from Parkinson's, he began using a wheelchair. Even so, he kept writing letters, hundreds, to graduates, college athletes, and veterans' widows. Each envelope included an aerial photo he had taken during his vice presidency, clouds tinged purple at 30,000 feet. In the dedications, he often repeated a version of the same advice: never let your gratitude for the miracle of waking up be less than your desire to serve. His final parachute jump came at age 90, despite friends trying to dissuade him. They warned of the risk to his frail health. He replied with humor, "Freefall never scared me. The landing's the tricky part." Done in tandem, under careful instruction, the jump produced images that went viral. A former president in navy blue gear, a wide grin on his face, slicing through the air as if he still flew a TBF Avenger. Upon landing, he clapped, removed his goggles, and softly said that, of all human sensations, the feeling of weightlessness in the air most resembled hope. When his condition worsened in November 2018, the family gathered around his bedside. The room carried the scent of ocean air, brought in by seashells collected by grandchildren on the Maine coast. Above the headboard hung a modest picture, a black and white photo of his 1944 rescue. Bush, sitting on the Finback's railing, wrapped in a blanket, he gazed at it long during his final lucid hours. Perhaps he saw not just his youth, but the quiet origin of every choice that followed, from volunteering at the UN to arms reduction treaties, to shaking hands with ideological rivals. As he closed his eyes, he murmured a short prayer, giving thanks for having returned when so many had not. The state funeral drew world leaders, veterans, students. Choirs sang hymns that recalled waves breaking on a ship's hull. At the end, as 6 soldiers folded the flag that draped the coffin, a flash of memory passed through the crowd, the reflective Pacific now transfigured in the marble of the National Cathedral. In the hearts of the surviving crew members, very few now, lived the certainty that the pilot who came back from hell had journeyed far beyond the fatal landing strip of Chichijima, sailing to the ultimate stronghold of responsibility and service. Days later, at the Presidential Museum, in College Station, visitors stopped before a simple yellow raft suspended by steel cables. It was the same one that saved him in the Pacific. At first glance, it looked fragile, faded with time, but upon reading the plaque, many realized that the fragile rubber ring had carried not only a young pilot, but the symbolic weight of everything he would go on to achieve. A young boy touched the raft's surface and asked his mother how something so small could have kept someone alive in such a vast ocean. She paused a moment before answering. Maybe because, at that moment, there was a very big heart squeezed inside. It was that heart that guided every turn in his journey, weaving an invisible thread between the stifling cockpit of the Avenger and the lit halls of diplomacy, between the metallic roar of right cyclones and the distant chime of bells in capitals, finally freed from nuclear fear. In this way, the life of George Herbert Walker Bush stands as a bridge over the turbulent waters of the 20th century, bearing witness that the fate of nations sometimes rests on decisions made in seconds. Close, enough to the fire to feel your skin burn, yet distant enough to glimpse, beyond the flames, the possibility of a less hostile world.